Billionaire CEO asked the black waitress for financial advice as a joke. Her answer shocked him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The room was filled with the chatter of excited voices, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of luxury as guests arrived at the exclusive downtown restaurant. This wasn't just any dinner. It was the kind of event where billion-dollar deals were forged behind velvet ropes, where the elite of the elite gathered to enjoy fine dining and even finer conversation. At the center of it all was Richard Kessler, a towering figure in the tech world. His company, Kessler Tech, had revolutionized industries, and his name was synonymous with power and success. Tonight, however, it was his ego that seemed to be in the spotlight more than his business acumen. He was surrounded by his usual crowd, investors, other CEOs, and a few political heavyweights, all eager to get a taste of his next big move. As the evening progressed, Richard couldn't help but notice Cassandra, a waitress who had been serving at his table. She moved with precision, effortlessly balancing plates and pouring wine. But there was something about her calm demeanor that stood out. Unlike the other staff, she didn't fawn over him or try to flatter him with false praise. Instead, she went about her job with quiet confidence, as if she knew exactly what she was doing. This, of course, made him curious. He had always been surrounded by people who catered to his every whim, and here was someone who didn't seem the least bit intimidated. As the night wore on, Richard found himself growing increasingly bored with the small talk around the table. Then, in a moment of arrogance, he decided to test the limits of this calm waitress's composure. So, tell me, Cassandra, he said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. What's your advice on the stock market? I mean, you must have some knowledge, right? You must know how to make money, even in this crazy economy. His question was wrapped in sarcasm, a clear challenge. The room fell silent for a moment as the guests waited for Cassandra's response. It was meant to be a joke, a way to poke fun at the waitress, to see if she could rise to the occasion or falter under the pressure. Cassandra, however, didn't flinch. She set down the wine bottle she had been holding, looked Richard directly in the eyes, and, without missing a beat, said, Well, Mr. Kessler, you're right about one thing. The stock market can be crazy. But the real trick is understanding where to put your money where it actually counts. You see, the most valuable assets aren't always the ones that can be traded on Wall Street. Sometimes, the best investment is the one you can't measure in dollars, like trust, reputation, and time. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Richard was stunned into silence. His usual smirk faded as he realized that Cassandra wasn't just playing along with his joke. She was speaking with conviction. The guests around the table exchanged puzzled glances, unsure how to react to this unexpected turn of events. Was this waitress actually trying to teach Richard Kessler something about business? Richard, ever the businessman, was known for his quick thinking and even quicker comebacks. But this time he was caught off guard. His usual charm and wit couldn't mask the fact that Cassandra's words had struck a nerve. He had underestimated her, and now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like the one being tested. As the dinner continued, Richard found himself reflecting on Cassandra's words. What she had said wasn't just some offhand remark. It had been a sharp, well-thought-out response, something he hadn't expected from someone in her position. Was there more to this woman than he had originally thought? Was it possible that the real lesson here wasn't about money, but about humility? Richard's mind raced as the night wore on, but one thing was clear. Cassandra had shocked him, and the power dynamic in the room had shifted in a way that no one had expected. The room fell into an awkward silence after Cassandra's unexpected response. Richard Kessler, a man who had built his empire through calculated risks and strategic investments, was momentarily lost for words. The usual smirk that always seemed to play at the corner of his lips faded, replaced by a furrowed brow and an air of discomfort that no one had ever seen before. His guests, all expecting him to crush this trivial challenge, now watched as he tried to regain his composure. Cassandra had done the unthinkable. She had turned the table on him. As the guests exchanged curious glances, Richard cleared his throat and straightened in his chair. His arrogance, normally a shield, now seemed brittle, almost fragile. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, especially not by someone in her position. He had expected a meek answer, something that would reaffirm his belief that people like Cassandra were only good for serving food and pouring drinks. But instead, she had offered a perspective that was sharp, insightful, and, most importantly, true. "Well, Mr. Kessler," Cassandra continued, her voice calm and unshaken, "the real trick is understanding what really holds value. Money comes and goes, but trust, integrity, and relationships, that's what really builds lasting wealth." Richard's mind raced. How could a waitress, someone who had never known the kind of power or success he had, understand this so clearly? The thought was unsettling. He had spent his entire life in boardrooms, making deals, pushing boundaries, and now, in the span of a single sentence, this woman had shown him a side of business he had never truly considered. As he sat there, trying to formulate a response, his eyes flicked to his assistant, who was nervously standing by, watching the scene unfold. The tension in the room was palpable. No one knew how to react. Some of the guests looked down at their plates, avoiding eye contact, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they should speak up. Richard, ever the opportunist, finally leaned forward with a forced smile. "I see," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "So, you're telling me that running a multi-billion-dollar company is about more than just numbers and profits? That's a novel idea." Cassandra didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze and replied, "I'm not saying business isn't about profits, but it's also about understanding people, what drives them, what they need, and how you can help them achieve that. You can't just look at the bottom line. You need to look at the bigger picture." Richard paused. Her words lingered in the air, each one cutting through his usual bravado. Was she right? Could it be that the success he had built wasn't as foolproof as he had always believed? He had always thought of himself as someone who understood power, how to wield it, how to use it to control situations and people. But Cassandra's words made him question that assumption. His usual method of dominating conversations, making people feel small to assert his superiority, no longer seemed as effective. There was something about her calm, unwavering confidence that had shaken him to his core. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until one of the guests, a young tech entrepreneur who had been watching the exchange with interest, cleared his throat. "Richard, maybe it's time to listen to what she's saying," he said, almost sheepishly. "I mean, you've always been the one telling us to look beyond the numbers, right? Maybe there's something we've all missed." Richard's gaze snapped toward the young man, who quickly looked down, realizing he had just spoken out of turn. The room grew even more uncomfortable. Richard, for the first time in years, felt vulnerable. This was not how he envisioned his evening going. He had intended to simply enjoy a quiet dinner, seal some deals, and bask in the glow of his success. Instead, he was sitting at the table with someone who had inadvertently exposed a flaw in his thinking, a flaw he wasn't sure how to fix. Cassandra's eyes never left his. She wasn't trying to win, wasn't trying to humiliate him. She was simply speaking the truth, in a way he had never been forced to listen to before. And in that moment, Richard realized something that would change him forever. True wealth wasn't just about accumulating more. It was about understanding what truly mattered. But it was too late for him to admit that. He wasn't the type to back down, to acknowledge that someone else had won. Instead, he tried to regain control. "All right then," he said, the words heavy with a forced smile. "Let's see if you can back up your words with action. Maybe I need a little more than just talk. How about a deal, Cassandra? Let's see if you can really turn things around. What's your next move?" But Cassandra, with all her calm and wisdom, simply responded, "My next move is to show you that what really matters is the people you choose to listen to." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Richard to wonder just how much he had missed in his relentless pursuit of power. The rest of the evening dragged on, but Richard Kessler's mind was far from the discussions at the dinner table. His usual confidence had been rattled, and no amount of wine could quiet the nagging feeling that Cassandra's words had planted in his mind. For years, he had built his empire on the belief that success was about domination, about asserting control in every room he entered. But tonight, a waitress had made him question that very notion, and it was starting to eat away at him. After the dinner ended, Richard excused himself from the gathering early. He didn't want to face anyone else, didn't want to hear their comments, or worse, their praise for Cassandra. He didn't understand it. How had she, a woman who served food, who was supposed to remain invisible, so easily cut through his armor? As he walked through the quiet streets of San Francisco, the cold night air felt sharp against his skin, but it was nothing compared to the sting of the evening's events. He had tried to convince himself that Cassandra's response was just a lucky shot, a fluke. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. It was something deeper, something he hadn't anticipated. The next morning, Richard found himself unable to focus on the usual routine. His assistant briefed him on upcoming meetings, but the words blurred together as his mind drifted back to that moment in the restaurant. His phone buzzed with messages from clients, investors, and colleagues, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. Then, at the bottom of his inbox, there was an email titled, "Following up on last night's discussion." It was from Cassandra. His heart skipped a beat as he clicked it open. She had written a brief message, not much more than a few lines, but it was enough to make Richard's chest tighten. "Mr. Kessler, thank you for the interesting conversation last night. I appreciate the opportunity to offer my thoughts. If you ever wish to discuss business strategies or the broader implications of your investments, feel free to reach out. Best regards, Cassandra." It was polite, professional, and distant. Yet somehow, it felt like an invitation to something deeper, a challenge, perhaps, or a glimpse into a perspective that he had been blind to for too long. Richard didn't respond right away. He sat at his desk, staring at her words, trying to figure out why it felt so important to him. Why did her message, her simple offer, leave him unsettled? It wasn't the words themselves, but the fact that they were coming from someone who had no reason to be talking to him, let alone offering him advice. She had shown him the power of humility, the value of seeing things through a different lens. She had shattered his carefully constructed world in a way he wasn't prepared for. That afternoon, Richard did something he rarely did. He picked up the phone and called Cassandra. The moment the phone rang, he questioned his decision. What was he doing? What could a billionaire CEO possibly have to say to a waitress? But it rang through, and finally, her voice answered. "Hello, this is Cassandra," she said, her tone calm, but with an undercurrent of professionalism that he couldn't ignore. Richard hesitated before speaking. "Cassandra, it's Richard Kessler. From last night. I've been thinking about what you said. I wanted to reach out and maybe continue the conversation." There was a slight pause on the other end, and Richard could almost hear her thinking, weighing her response. "Of course, Mr. Kessler," she replied. "I'd be happy to discuss further." Richard felt a strange sense of relief, as if he had been given permission to explore something that had been bugging him all along. They scheduled a meeting for the following week, and as soon as he hung up, Richard realized that he wasn't just doing this to prove a point or maintain his image. He genuinely wanted to know what Cassandra had to say. What was it that she understood about the world of business, about power, about human connection, that he hadn't learned in all his years of experience? The following week, they met at a quiet coffee shop in the city, away from the prying eyes of business associates and media. As they sat across from each other, Richard couldn't help but notice how Cassandra didn't seem intimidated by his presence. It was as if they were equals, sitting at the same table, discussing the same world. They talked about investments, about the changing dynamics of industries, and about the importance of building relationships rather than just chasing profit. Cassandra spoke with such clarity, explaining complex concepts in ways that made Richard reconsider his approach to business. By the end of their meeting, Richard felt as though he had gained a new perspective, one that he wasn't sure how to implement just yet, but one that had already begun to shift the way he thought. As he stood to leave, Richard extended his hand to Cassandra. "Thank you," he said, his voice genuine, "for challenging me. I think I've learned more from you in one meeting than I have in years of board meetings." Cassandra smiled, the warmth in her eyes matching the calmness in her voice. "The lesson, Mr. Kessler, isn't always in the numbers. Sometimes it's in the people we overlook." Richard nodded, his mind racing with new ideas, new possibilities. This was just the beginning. He had a lot to learn, but at least now, he was willing to listen. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Richard Kessler. His days were filled with meetings, deals, and the ever-present pressure to maintain his company's dominance in the tech world. But something had changed. Ever since his meeting with Cassandra, his perspective on business had begun to shift. He started questioning the traditional ways he had always done things. It wasn't that he had suddenly abandoned everything he had built his empire on, but he had begun to see things differently. He had learned that power wasn't just about control. It was about understanding, listening, and connecting on a deeper level. He began to apply these principles to his work, slowly but surely. He reached out to people he had once overlooked, listening to their ideas and considering their input in ways he never had before. It felt uncomfortable at times, even vulnerable, but he couldn't ignore the results. In just a few weeks, Richard began to see his business thrive in ways he hadn't expected. His new approach, though subtle, was beginning to resonate with his team and clients. As for Cassandra, Richard continued to seek her advice, though he now saw her as more than just a waitress. She was a mentor, a guide in ways that no business school or CEO roundtable had ever been. One morning, as Richard was reviewing some quarterly reports in his office, his assistant, Michelle, knocked on the door. "Mr. Kessler," she said, her voice hesitant, "there's someone here to see you. A Cassandra Jones. She says you've been expecting her." Richard looked up, surprised but pleased. He had invited Cassandra to visit his office after their last meeting, hoping to further explore some of the ideas they had discussed. He had not expected her to arrive so soon. "Send her in," he said, standing up from his desk. Cassandra walked in with the same calm presence she always had. Her attire was simple, no expensive designer suits, just a neat blouse and a pair of slacks. She smiled warmly as she entered, offering Richard a handshake. "It's good to see you again, Mr. Kessler," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Richard returned the handshake, his smile genuine. "Not at all, Cassandra. It's good to see you. Please, have a seat." As they sat down, Richard felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had invited her to discuss some new initiatives he was considering, ones that he believed could help his company grow even further. But this time, it wasn't just about numbers and market shares. He was genuinely interested in her opinion on leadership, on culture, and on creating a business environment where everyone felt valued, not just those at the top. "I've been thinking about some of the things you said to me that night," Richard began, his tone more thoughtful than usual. "You were right. I've spent my career focused on winning, on making money, but I've never really taken the time to listen to the people who make all of this possible. And it's not just about my team. It's about the bigger picture." Cassandra nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I've made changes, small ones for now, but I want to hear your thoughts on what it really takes to build something lasting. Something beyond just profit." Cassandra paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the room. "You're on the right track," she said, her voice steady. "But it's not just about the money or the success. It's about what you do with it, who you lift up along the way, the legacy you leave behind." Richard leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. "You're talking about culture, aren't you?" he asked. Cassandra smiled. "Exactly. It's about creating a space where people can thrive, where they feel heard, and where the company's success is everyone's." Success. Richard's mind was racing. It all made sense now. He had spent so much of his life focused on the end goal, the profits, the power. But the true success, the one that mattered, was the impact he could have on the lives of those around him. He stood up, his decision already made. "I want to do something bigger, Cassandra," he said, his voice firm. "I want to build a company where people feel empowered, where they can grow, where we all succeed together. I want you to help me with that. I want you to be part of this." Cassandra looked at him, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I'd be honored, Richard," she said. "But remember, the journey is just beginning. It's going to take time, effort, and patience. But I believe you're ready for it." Richard nodded. He knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just a billionaire CEO anymore. He was someone who could make a real difference, a difference that would echo through the lives of the people he worked with, and in the world beyond his office walls. Over the next few months, Richard Kessler's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. His leadership style had evolved, influenced by the insights Cassandra had shared with him. The changes were subtle at first, but they rippled throughout Kessler Tech in ways that couldn't be ignored. Richard started hosting weekly meetings with his senior team, inviting input from everyone, not just the usual executives. He made it clear that every voice mattered, from the entry-level employees to the top-tier management. As expected, Some were skeptical, unsure if these changes were just another corporate phase that would eventually fade away. But others, particularly those who had been with him for years, began to see the sincerity in his efforts. They noticed the shift, and soon, the word began to spread beyond the office walls. The culture at Kessler Tech was changing. The company's values were being redefined, moving away from a solely profit-driven model to one focused on collaboration, growth, and inclusivity. Richard's personal life also reflected these changes. He found himself spending more time outside the boardroom, engaging in community initiatives, and taking part in conversations about social responsibility. His newfound awareness about the importance of people, their well-being, and their future made him realize how much he had neglected in his pursuit of success. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about legacy. However, not everyone was happy with these changes. At the next shareholders' meeting, tensions were high. Some investors were concerned that the shift in focus might affect the company's bottom line. "Richard, we've seen the numbers," one of the shareholders said, his voice laced with impatience. "You've been spending a lot of time on these people initiatives, but we need to see the results. Profits are down, and this new direction seems risky." Richard's response was calm but firm. "We're not here to just make money. We're here to build something that lasts. I understand your concerns, but I believe investing in our people will result in better long-term outcomes for this company." There was a moment of silence in the room, as the shareholders processed his words. Richard knew that his decision wasn't going to be easy, and there would be bumps along the way. But for the first time, he was willing to stand by his beliefs, even if it meant facing resistance. Meanwhile, Cassandra remained by his side, offering advice when needed and providing a voice of reason during moments of uncertainty. Their partnership grew stronger, not just because of the professional insights she brought to the table, but because of the mutual respect they had for each other's perspectives. One day, Richard called Cassandra into his office for a meeting. "Cassandra," he began, his tone more serious than usual, "I've been thinking about something. I want to take Kessler Tech in a new direction, but I need someone to help guide this company through the next phase. Someone who understands the balance between profits and people. Someone like you." Cassandra's eyebrows raised slightly in surprise. "You want me to lead?" she asked. Richard nodded. "I trust you. I believe in the way you think, and I know you can bring Kessler Tech to new heights. I can't do this alone. I need someone who will make sure we stay true to our values, while still pushing for growth." Cassandra sat back in her chair, considering his offer. It wasn't just a job. It was a challenge, a chance to make a real difference, not just in the company, but in the way the business world viewed success. "I'm honored, Richard," she said finally, her voice steady. "And I'm ready. Let's make it happen." With Cassandra now in a leadership position, Kessler Tech began to flourish in ways Richard hadn't imagined. Their focus on nurturing talent, building inclusive teams, and prioritizing long-term success over short-term profits started to pay off. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, and client relationships were stronger than ever. The company's growth was more sustainable, more fulfilling, and, ultimately, more rewarding. And as the months passed, Richard began to see the fruits of their labor. He wasn't just a billionaire CEO anymore. He was someone who had built a company that genuinely cared about its people, its values, and its impact on the world. A company that didn't just measure success in dollars and cents, but in lives changed, relationships built, and trust earned. As Richard looked out his office window one evening, watching the sun set over the city, he realized that this journey had taken him to places he never thought he'd go, and he was grateful for every step of it. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about being at the top of the food chain. It was about lifting others up, guiding them, and building something that would last long after you were gone. It wasn't about winning at all costs. It was about creating a legacy that made the world a better place. And with Cassandra by his side, Richard knew they were on the right path. As Kessler Tech continued to grow under Richard and Cassandra's leadership, the shift in culture became undeniable. The company had gone from a profit-driven powerhouse to a more holistic, people-focused organization, and this transformation began to attract attention. News outlets began covering the company's new direction, calling it revolutionary. Articles praised their emphasis on employee well-being, sustainable practices, and transparent leadership. Richard received calls from fellow CEOs, some curious, others skeptical, and some even trying to learn from what was happening at Kessler Tech. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The corporate world was slow to adapt to the idea of valuing people as much as profits, and Richard soon found himself facing criticism from both internal and external sources. A large number of the older investors were uncomfortable with the pace of change. Richard, one of the veteran shareholders, said during a tense meeting, "We appreciate your vision, but you need to understand that there's a fine line between nurturing your team and losing sight of the bottom line. This company has always been about results, and results are measured in dollars, not values." Richard sat there, feeling the weight of the criticism. He understood where the shareholder was coming from, but he also knew that the results they had achieved so far spoke for themselves. The numbers were up, the morale was higher than ever, and Kessler Tech was seeing unprecedented levels of customer loyalty. Still, Richard knew he had to make sure they didn't lose sight of their core mission. He knew that change wasn't just about making people feel good. It had to have a real, tangible impact on the company's success. After the meeting, Richard called Cassandra into his office. He needed to talk through the concerns and figure out how they could balance their new approach with the pressures of the business world. "Cassandra," Richard said, "I'm hearing a lot of pushback. Some of the investors think we're losing focus. They think the company's values are great, but they want results. Real results. The kind that can't be argued with." Cassandra sat across from him, her eyes steady as always. She had a way of calming the storm inside him, even when things were at their most tense. "I get it," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We're already seeing the impact of what we've built. The way our people are engaged, the way customers are responding. The success we're achieving isn't just financial. It's cultural. It's the kind of success that lasts." Richard nodded slowly. She was right. But he also knew the realities of the business world. "I agree, but we need to prove it. We need to show them that this new approach can deliver long-term results. I don't want them to see us as just a feel-good story. I want them to see the results we're generating." Cassandra leaned forward, her expression sharp. "We will, Richard. We're already seeing it. The key is consistency. We keep doing what we're doing, focusing on our people, focusing on doing things the right way, and the numbers will follow. We just need to give it time. But if we compromise now, if we start making decisions based on short-term pressure, we might lose what we've worked so hard to build." Richard took a deep breath. Cassandra's words were a reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. He wasn't interested in a quick win. He wanted something sustainable. He wanted a company that didn't just churn out profits, but also made a real impact on the lives of its employees, customers, and the community at large. The next few months were a test of patience and perseverance. Richard and Cassandra worked together to navigate the growing pains of their new approach. They found ways to demonstrate the long-term benefits of their changes, using data to back up their beliefs. Slowly, the skeptics began to see the results. Employee retention rates were higher than ever, and customer satisfaction scores were through the roof. Investors, though still cautious, started to warm to the idea that Kessler Tech was building something more than just a profitable company. It was building a legacy. As Richard stood on the stage at the company's annual shareholder meeting, he looked out at the sea of faces in the crowd. The room was filled with a mixture of old and new investors, some eager, others uncertain. But this time, Richard felt a sense of calm. He had confidence in the path they had chosen. "I know there have been questions about the direction we've taken," Richard began, his voice steady. "But I want to assure you all that the changes we've made aren't just about being different. They're about being better, about creating something that will last. This company is more than just a business. It's a community, and we're going to keep building on that foundation together. The results will come, and when they do, they'll be the kind of results that matter. Not just in dollars, but in lives, in relationships, and in the legacy we leave behind." The room was silent for a moment, but as Richard finished speaking, a round of applause broke out. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, but it was enough. Enough to show Richard that the company he had built wasn't just a machine for generating profits. It was a force for good. And that, in the end, was worth more than all the numbers on a balance sheet. As the year progressed, Kessler Tech's reputation continued to rise, both within the business world and beyond. Richard's vision for the company had slowly started to take shape, and while the journey had not been without its struggles, he began to see the fruits of his labor. The transition had been difficult for some, particularly the investors who still viewed financial success through the narrow lens of immediate profit margins. However, the tide was shifting, and even the most skeptical began to notice the long-term results. Employee engagement was at an all-time high, with people across the company feeling empowered and heard. They weren't just working for a paycheck anymore. They were working for something that mattered. Richard knew that this was just the beginning. His personal growth had been intertwined with the evolution of Kessler Tech. As his understanding of leadership, people, and purpose deepened, so too did his commitment to the values Cassandra had taught him. It wasn't about playing the game by the same old rules anymore. It was about creating a new game, one where everyone had a seat at the table. Despite the positive momentum, there were still challenges ahead. As Richard sat in his office, reviewing the latest quarterly report, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. While the company was thriving, he knew that true change would take time, and in the world of business, time was a luxury few could afford. But it was in these moments of quiet reflection that Richard found clarity. He understood now that the most important thing was to stay committed to the path they had chosen, even when the road got tough. As he looked out the window, watching the city lights blink on in the distance, Richard thought about the journey ahead. He had never expected it to be easy, but he had never imagined it would be this fulfilling. He had learned that success wasn't just about wealth. It was about the impact you had on those around you. And as for Cassandra, her role in Kessler Tech was more vital than ever. She had become a trusted ally, someone who not only understood the heart of the company, but also knew how to guide it forward with wisdom and grace. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Richard called Cassandra into his office. The atmosphere was different now, more familiar, more comfortable. Cassandra had grown into her leadership role, and the team respected her insight as much as they did Richard's. "Cassandra," Richard began, his tone thoughtful, "I've been thinking about the next step. We've made so much progress, but we need to take things even further. The culture we've built here, it's stronger than ever. But how do we make sure it stays that way as we grow? How do we ensure that we don't lose sight of what truly matters as we scale up?" Cassandra looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. "You know, Richard," she said, "I think the real challenge is keeping the focus on people as we expand. It's easy to get caught up in numbers, but the core of our success is in the relationships we build inside the company, with our clients, and with the community. If we keep those relationships strong, everything else will follow." Richard nodded, appreciating her perspective. "That's exactly what I've been thinking," he replied. "It's about creating a lasting impact. We need to make sure that as we grow, we're not just scaling a business, we're scaling a legacy." Cassandra's smile widened, and she leaned back in her chair. "I believe in this vision, Richard," she said, "and I'm excited to see where we can take it. We've only just begun, but I think we're on the right track." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the future. Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had started this journey thinking he knew what success looked like, but now he understood that it was about so much more than financial gain. It was about creating something meaningful, something that would endure long after they were gone. The following months saw Richard and Cassandra working even more closely together, refining their strategy and continuing to foster a culture of collaboration, integrity, and purpose. The results were undeniable. Kessler Tech's growth was not just financial. It was sustainable, fulfilling, and impactful. Their employees were more than just workers. They were partners in the company's success. Their clients weren't just customers. They were collaborators who believed in the company's mission. And their community wasn't just a market. It was a reflection of the values Kessler Tech had built. As the company entered its next phase, Richard knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be obstacles to overcome. But with Cassandra by his side and the entire team behind him, he was confident that they would continue to create something extraordinary. Kessler Tech wasn't just a business anymore. It was a movement, one that would leave a lasting mark on the world, proving that true success wasn't just about profits. It was about people, purpose, and the legacy you built along the way. As the months passed, Kessler Tech's transformation continued to unfold, and the changes Richard and Cassandra had worked so hard to implement began to take shape in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. The company was growing, yes, but it was also evolving into something more, something that transcended the traditional definitions of success. The foundation they had built was stronger than ever, And while the journey had not been without challenges, they were beginning to see the long-term effects of their vision. The culture of Kessler Tech was now a living, breathing entity, one that valued people as much as profits. But with growth came new obstacles. Richard had always known that scaling a company came with risks, and now, those risks were beginning to materialize. Competitors were taking notice of Kessler Tech's success, and some of them were starting to make aggressive moves. They had long viewed Kessler Tech as just another tech company with deep pockets, but now they realized it was more than that. Richard and Cassandra had managed to create a company that wasn't just competing in the marketplace. It was setting the stage for a new kind of business, one that prioritized people and purpose. One particularly powerful competitor, a global tech giant, decided to launch a direct attack on Kessler Tech. They undercut Kessler Tech's prices, targeted their customers, and started poaching key employees. Richard knew that Kessler Tech couldn't afford to play the same game. They had always been focused on building relationships, not cutting corners for short-term gain. But the competition's tactics were hard to ignore. The pressure to respond quickly was immense. Richard turned to Cassandra for advice. "This is the moment, Cassandra," he said, leaning over his desk, his voice filled with determination. "We've built something that's different, but they're playing dirty. We need to figure out how to turn this around. Fast." Cassandra, ever the calm and collected voice of reason, didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a deep breath, considering their options. "Richard, we've already won in ways they don't even realize. Our people, our culture, our values, they can't replicate that. What they're doing is short-term. We can't play their game, but we can show the world that the way we do. Business is the way of the future." Richard looked at her, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "What are you suggesting?" Cassandra smiled faintly, her confidence unwavering. "Let them play the price game. We'll win by playing the long game. We'll invest more in our people, in our community, in our values. We'll show our customers why they choose us, because we're not just another company trying to make a buck. We're a company that believes in something bigger." Richard felt a surge of relief. Cassandra's approach was exactly what he needed to hear. It wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about doubling down on the things that made Kessler Tech unique. "You're right," he said, standing up and pacing the room. "We're not just here to win in the marketplace. We're here to change the way people think about business. It's time to go all in on our values, and let that be our differentiator." Over the next few weeks, Richard and Cassandra worked together to amplify Kessler Tech's unique selling points. They launched new initiatives to further invest in employee development, social responsibility, and environmental sustainability. They increased their community outreach efforts, partnering with local organizations and schools to create opportunities for young people to enter the tech industry. Richard made sure that Kessler Tech's customers knew they weren't just paying for a product or service. They were supporting a company that cared about making a positive impact. They used their platform to highlight the work being done within their organization to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they invited their clients and partners to join them in supporting these causes. As the months went by, Kessler Tech's response to the competition became clear. They didn't need to match the price cuts or underhanded tactics. Instead, they focused on what they did best, building relationships. Their customers began to rally behind them, not just because of the products they offered, but because of the values they stood for. And as the competition's tactics began to backfire, Kessler Tech's reputation as a company with integrity continued to grow. Employees, clients, and even competitors began to take notice of the company's unwavering commitment to people and purpose. One day, during a meeting with the board of directors, Richard stood in front of the room, feeling more confident than ever. He looked around at the faces of the people who had been with him from the beginning, people who had supported him even when the road seemed uncertain. "We've weathered the storm," he said, his voice filled with pride. "And we've done it by staying true to who we are. Kessler Tech isn't just a company. It's a movement, and we're just getting started." The room erupted in applause, and Richard could feel the weight of everything they had built together. He knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but he also knew that they were ready for whatever came next. As the meeting wrapped up, Cassandra approached him, a smile on her face. "You were right, Richard," she said. "This is just the beginning." Richard smiled back, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "Yes, Cassandra. And I think we've only scratched the surface of what we can do. As Kessler Tech continued to grow and evolve, Richard and Cassandra found themselves in the position they had once dreamed about, leading a company that was not only financially successful, but also made a positive impact on the world. They had faced immense challenges along the way, from resistance within the company to the relentless pressure from competitors. But through it all, they had stayed true to their values that placed people at the heart of everything they did. The vision they had built together was now a living, breathing part of the company's DNA. One evening, as Richard sat in his office, reflecting on the company's progress, Cassandra walked in, a familiar smile on her face. She had been with him from the beginning, and now they were ready for the next chapter. "You know," she said, as she took a seat across from him, "we've come a long way. But I think we both knew this wasn't just about building a company. It was about building something that would last." Richard nodded, a deep sense of pride in his chest. "It's more than I could have ever imagined, Cassandra. I used to think that success was all about numbers, about outsmarting everyone else. But now, I realize it's about the people we affect, the lives we change." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The world outside was bustling with activity, but inside the walls of Kessler Tech, it felt like they had created a sanctuary, one that was centered around the principles they had championed from the start. "I remember when we were first talking about all of this," Cassandra continued, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "You were worried about how we could make it work. You didn't want to lose the edge we had, the drive for success. But look at where we are now. We're doing better than we ever imagined, and we're doing it the right way." Richard smiled, the weight of the past few years lifting from his shoulders. "We really are. But none of this would have been possible without you, Cassandra. You've been the voice of reason, the one who kept me grounded when I wanted to take shortcuts or give in to the pressure. This success is as much yours as it is mine." Cassandra chuckled, her eyes gleaming with humility. "We've both played our part. You've come a long way, Richard. You've learned to see the bigger picture, to understand that leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about making the right decisions for the people around you." As they spoke, the future of Kessler Tech seemed brighter than ever. The company had become a shining example of what was possible when values like integrity, collaboration, and community were placed at the forefront of business. They had built something meaningful, something that transcended the typical corporate model. Employees, clients, and even competitors were taking notice. They weren't just another tech company anymore. They were a beacon for a new kind of business, one that valued people over profits and purpose over short-term success. It wasn't just about winning anymore. It was about making a difference. As the years passed, Kessler Tech became an industry leader not just in terms of revenue, but in the way it shaped the business world. Richard and Cassandra had created a company that was sustainable, not just in terms of finances, but in terms of its impact on society. They had proven that it was possible to run a successful business without compromising on values. And as they stood together on the stage at the company's annual gala, surrounded by their team and partners, Richard couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. "This company," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "was built on the idea that we could do things differently. And now, we stand here as proof that doing things the right way isn't just possible, it's the best way. This is just the beginning. Our legacy isn't measured by profits or stock prices. It's measured by the lives we've touched and the future we've created for the next generation." The room erupted in applause, and Richard could see the pride in his employees' eyes. They had built something lasting, something that would continue to grow and evolve for years to come. They had created a business that wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about people, purpose, and the lasting impact they could have on the world. As the night came to a close, Richard and Cassandra stood side by side, looking out at the bright future ahead of them. They knew there would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but they were ready. They had created something that mattered, something that would continue to inspire others to follow their own paths, with integrity and purpose, no matter where the road took them.